Well, this morning we're going to be looking at a short part of the passage that we read earlier from Luke chapter 12. And we're really going to be focusing on verses 13 to 21. And in the NIV, this section is entitled, The Parable of the Rich Fool. But before we look at this parable, I'd like to quickly look at what led up to Jesus telling it. Now, I don't know if you noticed when we were reading through the chapter, but there appears to be quite a jump as we go from verse 12 to verse 13. In the first part of the chapter, we read about Jesus speaking to a crowd of people. Verse 1, "Meanwhile, when a crowd of many thousands had gathered so that they were trampling each other, Jesus began to speak first to his disciples. As on many other occasions, people had gathered from miles around to hear what this preacher from Galilee had to say. People were eager to hear his teaching. So much so that these people were crowding in and began to trample on one another. Now, it's not clear from the passage when Jesus stopped talking just to his disciples and began to address the wider crowd. But in these verses at the beginning of chapter 12, we've got some pretty serious teaching about the cost of following Jesus. Being a true disciple of Jesus has never been an easy option. Verse 4, "I tell you, my friends, do not be afraid of those who kill the body, and after that can do no more." Being faithful followers of Jesus for those early disciples could have terrible consequences. And for many of them it did. And the same is true in many places in the world today. Being a disciple of Christ, being prepared to stand up for him, can cost us a lot, even to the extent of laying down our lives in his service. But Jesus assured his followers that they should not fear. Their loving Heavenly Father knows their worth and he is watching over them. And in verse 8, Jesus follows this up with the sign of what a true disciple is like. They are prepared to acknowledge him before man, no matter what the cost. But there is also a flip side to this as well, because those that fail to acknowledge him before man should examine themselves carefully, because this failure to acknowledge him before man could be an indication that you are not one of his people. And that's an incredibly sobering thought, isn't it? Verses 8 and 9. "I tell you, whoever acknowledges me before men, the Son of Man will also acknowledge him before the angels of God. But he who disowns me before men will be disowned before the angels of God." And we can see something similar in Jesus' teaching that we read about in Matthew chapter 7. "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons and perform many miracles?' Then I will say to them plainly, 'I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers.'" It is so important that if we claim to be followers of Christ, then we really, really are seeking to follow him. It is a matter of our eternal destiny. Truly, we can say it is a matter of life and death for all eternity. And these are the things that Jesus is talking about at the beginning of Luke chapter 12, things that are of the utmost importance. They have to have a realistic view of what it means to be a follower of Christ. And then he warns them about the situations that they're going to face in the future. Verse 11, when? No, when, not if. When you are brought before synagogues, rulers and authorities, do not worry about how you will defend yourselves or what you will say, for the Holy Spirit will teach you at that time what you should say. A true follower of Christ should expect trouble in this life. They should expect to come into conflict with the authorities. The teachings of Jesus are radical and the complete opposite to the values that the world desires and respects. The values that it not just wants us to share, but even to promote. And we can see something of this in Acts chapter 17 when there was trouble for the Christians in Thessalonica. We read from the English Standard Version, Acts 17 verse 6 says this, "And when they could not find them," that is talking about Paul and Silas, "they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the city authorities, shouting, 'These men who have turned the world upside down have come here also. This world is not what it should be. It is not in the perfect state that it was created. The entry of sin into this world turned it upside down. But men are so used to the way that it is that they fail to recognise this. They consider this fallen world normal. And when the followers of Christ seek to show men what this world was created for, what it should really be like, then man in his fallen state finds it incredibly disconcerting. They think that we are turning the world upside down, when in fact we are simply turning it back the right way up. So we can see in these early verses of Luke chapter 12, Jesus is given some tremendously important teaching. And whether that teaching was intended just for his disciples or for the whole crowd that has gathered is in a sense unimportant. Because those crowding in around him would be able to hear what was said and be able to learn from it and benefit from his teaching. And into this teaching, a voice breaks in from the crowd. A voice blurts out, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide this inheritance with me." What has this got to do with what Jesus has been speaking about? Absolutely nothing. You know, this man is in an incredibly privileged position. He was able to listen firsthand to the teaching of Jesus, to learn directly from the Master. But he had other things on his mind, things that he thought were far more important. Because instead of listening, he's been going over and over in his mind an injustice. His brother was withholding his inheritance. And finally, he can stand it no longer. He bursts out. He has to bring it to Jesus' attention so that Jesus can rule in his favour and force his brother to give him what he believes is rightfully his. And we should note at this point that perhaps this man might have a legitimate case. It could be that his brother was failing to give him what he was owed, what was due to him. It could be that his brother was such a one as the Jews called Ben Hamazon, a son of violence, who took not only the part of the estate that was due to him, but his brothers also. But it could also be the case that what was happening was simply a perceived injustice in his mind. And in his commentary, Matthew Henry suggests the appeal being made to Christ might be an appeal to change the law. That perhaps this man was a younger brother who thought it unfair that his older brother had inherited the double portion and wanted their father's estate to be distributed more evenly. And Matthew Henry writes this: "I suspect that this was the case because Christ takes occasion from it to warn against covetousness, a desire of having more than God in his providence has allotted us. It was not a lawful desire of getting his own, but a sinful desire of getting more than his own." But whatever the rights or wrongs of this case, the issue was that these things were distracting him from the things that were really important. Instead of appreciating the amazing privilege he had of listening to the teaching of Christ and learning from them, he is squandering this opportunity. He's been turning this injustice over and over in his mind until it festers and boils up and he can't hold it any longer and it comes bursting out. And perhaps we can find it easy to condemn this man. We might ask, what was he thinking of? But are we really so very different? Not that I'm anticipating someone calling out to me during the service to appeal to judge their dispute with their brother. I think you'd be pretty foolish to do that anyway. But do we recognise this tremendous privilege we have that as we gather together, we are gathered together here with God's people. We're able to meet together to worship God and to enjoy fellowship together without fear of the authorities. We have God's word available to us in our own language. And I hope and pray that as we meet together this morning, we have the presence of God's Holy Spirit teaching us from God's word, helping us to understand it and to learn from it what God requires of us. Such tremendous privileges. And yet, do we recognise and appreciate them? How many of us here this morning are like this man? Rather than listening to what God has to say to us this morning, we are turning things over and over in our mind. Perhaps it is something that's happened in the past week when we feel we've been treated unjustly or unfairly. Perhaps there's something we wish that we could have dealt with in a different manner, a better manner, and we keep turning over in our minds what we could have done differently. Perhaps it is the future that is worrying us. But no matter the cause, instead of stilling our minds and listening to what God has to say to us through his word, we are distracted. We turn things over and over in our own mind, looking at them from all sorts of different angles and playing out different scenarios, allowing things to fester and to boil up. And I'm sure that it is no coincidence that in the next section in Luke chapter 12, which we're not going to look at this morning, it tells us not to worry. So as we come into God's house, into his presence, as we hear the preaching of God's word this morning, let us make sure we appreciate the tremendous privileges we have and make the best use of them. Let us seek to focus our minds upon Christ and what he has to say to us, even this morning. Let us seek to banish these distracting worries and cares from our mind and seek to learn from God's word. So how does Jesus deal with this interruption? Well, he first points out that it is not his place to interfere in this issue. He asks the man, "Who appointed me as judge or an arbiter between you?" And at first sight, we might think this is strange. Surely Jesus must have some authority in this matter. But the point that Jesus is making is that there are earthly authorities who have been delegated the power to deal with these issues. Strictly speaking, the matter should have been taken to them. And typically, this is the sort of argument, the issue that a rabbi would normally have dealt with. And perhaps this man had already gone to them, but had been ruled against and was trying to use Jesus as a sort of court of appeal or something. And we need to remember here that Jesus himself said his kingdom is not of this world. His is not a physical kingdom, it is a spiritual kingdom. And if this man had come to him with concerns about his heavenly inheritance, then how gladly Christ would have helped him. And as always, Jesus was able to identify what the real problem was. The problem that this man had was not really with his brother. Whatever the rights or wrongs of the case, the real problem was this man's heart. He wanted more. And so Jesus warned him, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed." In other versions, this is translated as, "Be on your guard against all covetousness." And there is this idea here of an eager or excessive desire, particularly for wealth or possessions. And that was what was most important in this man's life. He wanted to accumulate wealth or possessions, and his brother was withholding from him these things that he really, really wanted. The settlement of the estate was merely a means to an end. He wanted to be rich. And then Jesus tells him why it is so important that he is on his guard. And this is something that each one of us should take to heart as well. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. Remember what I said earlier about how different our values should be to those of the world. Aren't these words of Jesus a striking illustration of that? Isn't the message of the world that we will be happy if we can only accumulate enough stuff? Now, perhaps this does not have the same prominence as it did a few years ago, when the possession of wealth for its own sake was lauded. Such films as Wall Street promoted this idea, and they are still heavily quoted. Greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right, greed works. What's worth doing is worth doing for money. But today, that sort of attitude perhaps can be seen as a bit crass. But it doesn't mean that those attitudes are not still there, albeit more subtly or framed in a way that people see as in a more worthy manner. And this idea permeates throughout popular culture, from pop songs such as Opportunities. Ask yourself this question: do you want to be rich? I've got the brains, you've got the looks. Let's make lots of money. You've got the brawn, I've got the brain. Let's make lots of money. And even then in the lyrics, the authors recognise that people may be prepared to go to any lengths in this pursuit of wealth. Because later on in that song, the lyrics say, if you've got the inclination, I have got the crime. Oh, there's lots of opportunities if you know when to take them. If there aren't, you can make them. How about popular sitcoms? This time next year, we'll be millionaires. If we work hard and get the right breaks and probably cut a few corners, we're going to make it. We'll be rich. That's what we should be aiming for. Or even recent adverts on the television. I wonder what you would do if you had the power to dream any dream you wanted to dream, you would, I suppose, start out by fulfilling all your wishes, love affairs, banquets, wonderful journeys, music beyond belief. The world tells us that we will be happy if we are rich. If we have enough money, we can buy whatever it is that it will take to make us content and fulfilled. We are surrounded by this message in all parts of our culture, and it is so easy for us to be taken in and deceived by it. But Jesus tells us a man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. And to illustrate this, Jesus told a parable. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. And there can be a danger when we read this parable superficially, that we can be very much on the side of this man. You know, he's worked hard, he's paid his dues, and finally things have gone right for him. He's managed to harvest a good crop. Good for him, he's got every right to enjoy it. But notice what we are told right at the beginning of this parable. This man was already rich. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. This is not some poor farmer labouring hard under the blazing sun day after day, usually just scratching enough of a living to survive. This man already has more than enough. He is rich. And as such, it is unlikely that it is his own hard work that has contributed to the success of his harvest. Almost certainly all the hard work has been done by labourers that he has used and perhaps even exploited. But as the owner of the land, it is him that reaps the rewards. And this leaves the man with a terrible problem. He has nowhere near enough space to store all this bumper harvest. And clearly what he says in verses 17 is said for an effect and for exaggeration. What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. And we can see in the following verse that this isn't strictly speaking true, because he comes up with a solution to his problem. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. This man already had barns, and presumably there was already stuff in these barns. That was the problem. But they weren't sufficient for the task. So this man's answer was to pull them down and to build bigger ones, so that he could store all his grain and his goods. He was not going to let any of this go. It was his and his alone. He wanted to be able to hang on to all of it. And this very idea of storing it has its own issues. If something is being stored, then it's not being used. And this applies to the food that could have been used to feed the poor, and his other possessions which are serving no useful purpose while they're just sitting in his barns. But this was his solution. And he says once he's done this, he's going to be able to take life easy. He will be able to say to himself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. He'll be able to take early retirement and spend his days sitting on the porch in his rocking chair, drinking pina coladas. But he hasn't thought this through properly. Having these goods stored up is not going to be the end of his problems and his worries. Instead, he's going to have a whole different set of problems and things to worry about. How long are his crops going to last if they're stored in a barn? Sometimes something like grain can be stored for many years if it's stored under the right conditions. But has he done the calculations? How long is he anticipating his retirement lasting? How much is he going to use each year? Will pests get into his barn and eat the crops? How is he going to guard against the starving peasants breaking in and stealing? What happens if lightning strikes his barn and burns them down and all his possessions are destroyed? Well, maybe he had thought through these things and thought he had all the answers. But there was one thing that he had not counted on. Verse 20. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? And all through this parable, we see evidence of this man's mentality. Everything is about him. My crops, my barns, my goods. This man was living with no thought for anyone else. He had no thought for his fellow men. What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. He doesn't answer this dilemma by saying, I know I will give them to the poor and the starving, to those who have need of them. Instead, he resolved to keep these things for himself. But even worse, This man was living with no thought for God, no thought for what would happen to him when he died. And if we are properly to understand what Jesus is trying to teach us in this parable, then we also need to make sure that we understand what is not being taught. The problem that this man had was not that he was rich. There is nothing intrinsically wrong with being either rich or being poor. If we look through the Bible, we can see there are examples of God's people who are rich and are not condemned for being rich. Genesis chapter 13, verse 2. Abraham had become very wealthy in livestock and in silver and gold. 2 Chronicles chapter 1, verses 14 to 16. Solomon accumulated chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses, which he kept in the chariot cities, and also with him in Jerusalem. The king made silver and gold as common in Jerusalem as stones, and cedar as plentiful as sycamore fig trees in the foothills. Solomon's horses were imported from Egypt and from Kew. The royal merchants purchased them from Kew. And again in 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 21, all Solomon's goblets were gold, and all the household articles in the palace of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. Nothing was made of silver, because silver was considered of little value in Solomon's day. Solomon had this vast, almost incomprehensible wealth. Job chapter 1. In the land of Uz there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 donkeys. He was the greatest man among all the people of the East. And Job gives us an example of what the attitude of this rich man should have been. The issue the rich farmer had in the parable was not that he was rich, it was his attitude towards the things that he had. He considered them to belong to him, to be grasped tightly, to be spent on his pleasures. Being rich in and of itself is not wrong. It is how we obtain, retain, and use all that we've been given that makes a difference. These things we have are all gifts from a loving Heavenly Father, but they do not belong to us. They belong to Him. They have been entrusted to our care for a short time, and we should make use of them as wise stewards. The prophet Hosea was sent to the people of Israel to remind them of this. Hosea chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. She has not acknowledged that I was the one who gave her the grain, the new wine and oil, who lavished on her the silver and gold which they used to Baal. Therefore I will take away my grain when it ripens, and my new wine when it is ready. I will take back my wool and my linen intended to cover her nakedness. And a similar idea comes out in the New Testament in the parable of the talents, which we find in Matthew chapter 25. And we don't have time to go into the details of that parable this morning. But if you read it when you get home, you'll find that there are 2 servants who are commended by their master. They have taken what he has entrusted to them and put it to good use. But the 3rd servant hid what he had been given and did not make the use of it that he should have done. And for this he was condemned by his master. If we recognise that all we have does not truly belong to us, but is entrusted to us by God, then we should change the attitude and the way we use things. It should change our whole attitude towards the things that we have and the things that we desire. And going back to Job, we can see that this is the case. This man, the greatest man among all the peoples of the East, lost just about everything in a single day. The 500 yoke of oxen and the 500 donkeys taken by a Sabaean raiding party. His 7,000 sheep burned up by fire which fell from the sky. His 3,000 camels taken by the Chaldeans. His servants slaughtered and his children dying when the house in which they were eating fell on them. It is really impossible for us to properly comprehend what Job went through. What would be our reaction if we lost everything that we owned? Every one of the things that we possess, all of those who we love, gone in a single day. I have serious doubts that my attitude would be that of Job. Job chapter 2, verses 20 to 22. At this, Job got up and tore his robe and shaved his head. Then he fell to the ground in worship and said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. It's not wrong to be rich, but we must recognise that all we have comes from God and should be used wisely in his service. And because it is his, we should not expect to retain possession of it forever. But we should also recognise that being rich is not necessarily a mark of God's approval of us or what we are doing. The prophet Amos was scathing in his condemnation of the Israelites that had become rich through the oppression of the poor that were among them. In Matthew chapter 5, we read Jesus telling the people that God causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends his rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. As this rich fool rejoiced in his good crop and planned his future, he failed to give thanks where it was due. It was God who had sent the sun and the rain at just the right time for the crop to grow. And in God's common grace, he gives good gifts to those that are far from him, as well as to his own people. We should never consider our possessions a sign of God's pleasure with us. So if this parable is not about the evil of wealth or about God blessing this man because he was good, what is it about? It is about the way that we live our lives looking to an eternal future. This world is not our home. We are simply travellers passing through it. No matter how long we live here, be it 70, 80 or even 100 years, we are eventually going to move on. In 1789, the American statesman Benjamin Franklin wrote a letter. In this world, nothing can be said to be certain, except death and taxes. Well, perhaps this rich fool had avoided or evaded paying tax, but there was something that he could not avoid. God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you." None of us knows when it is our time to die. Like the rich fool, we might think that we have plenty of time, that we have many years before we have to worry about death. But how can you be sure that that is the case? Could it be that God is saying to you even today, this very night, your life will be demanded from you? Are you ready? Because when you die, you will face judgment. And when that happens, what will be your defence? That you have lived a good life? That you have helped the poor? That you haven't done anything that's so terribly wrong? Well, the Bible makes it clear there is only one way that we can be saved. We simply cannot be good enough in our own strength, in our own deeds. In fact, in the book of Isaiah, even the best of our deeds are compared to filthy rags. How then can we be right with God? It is only through the blood of our Lord Jesus Christ. When he died on the cross at Calvary, he took the punishment that we deserved. And the prophet Isaiah foretold this many years before. Isaiah chapter 53. Surely he took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows. Yet we considered him stricken by God, smitten and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. If we are trusting in the Lord Jesus Christ alone for our salvation, then we have one who will plead for us when we face the judgment. The price has already been paid. We will be free to go, to enjoy an eternity in heaven with our Saviour and with our Heavenly Father. But what if you are not trusting in Jesus for your salvation? Then you will quite rightly be condemned and will face an eternity in hell. If, like that rich fool tonight, your life is demanded from you, where will you spend eternity? But perhaps you're sitting here this morning thinking to yourself, well, I'm a Christian, I come to church regularly, what does this parable have to say to me? Well, certainly it is clear this parable is written about a man who had no time or thought for God, but it should also challenge each one of us who is a Christian. I quoted earlier from Matthew chapter 7, and a few verses before the ones I quoted, Jesus said this. He said, "By their fruits you will know them." And in the context, Jesus is talking about false prophets, but the same is true of every Christian. We will be known by our fruit, by the way that we live our lives, by the priorities that we have in our lives. What are you living for? What's the most important thing in your life? What is your number one priority? Jesus warns us that we are to be on our guard against all kinds of greed. And perhaps there is a temptation to think of greed solely in terms of accumulation of wealth. But there are other kinds of greed as well. For example, we could be greedy with our time, not willing to use it in God's service or to help others. We had someone from Caring for Life here on Thursday night tell us about the work of Caring for Life. And he was telling about some of the work that they do in the community amongst vulnerable people. And one of the things he said was about the emotional energy that it took. Are we greedy with that emotional energy that we're not prepared to give that in God's service? And as we come to Jesus' application of this parable, we should take careful note. Verse 21. This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich towards God. Are you rich towards God? Do you recognize that all you have belongs to God and you should be willing to use it in his service, whether that be time or energy or more material things? And I would urge you as you go home to take a good look at yourself and to be honest with yourself. Are you rich towards God? Or are you giving him the bare minimum that you think you can get away with? Because if you are not rich towards God, then you are like this rich fool, no matter what you claim to be. And as we sing our final hymn that helps us think about this more, our last hymn is 830, Take My Life and Let It Be. And in this hymn we sing about all the things that we should be given to God, how we should be using everything in his service. So as we sing this hymn, just think carefully about the words. Hymn 830, Take My Life and Let It Be.